This happened a few years ago, back in the summer of 2022. I had just graduated college and wanted a little break before diving into job hunting. I booked an Airbnb cabin deep in the forests of Oregon. The place looked perfect, straight out of a Pinterest board, rustic, surrounded by tall pines, with a small creek running nearby. I brought my dog, Buster, a golden retriever, planning to stay for a week and completely unwind. The first few days were great. We hiked during the day, and Buster happily splashed in the creek. Evenings were spent by the fireplace, watching Netflix, sipping coffee, and listening to the wind and crickets outside. The cabin was remote, but the cell service was decent, so I wasn't completely cut off. There were no neighbors for miles, and the nearest town was an hour's drive away. The sheer quietness of the place made me feel more relaxed than I had been in years. On the fifth morning, I woke up to find one of the living room windows wide open. I distinctly remembered closing all the windows before bed because it had gotten chilly. I didn't think much of it, figured I'd forgotten, or maybe Buster had accidentally nudged it open. He did silly things sometimes. I closed it, then took Buster for our usual walk. When we got back, Buster suddenly started a low growl at the back door. It wasn't his usual excited bark at a squirrel, but a deep, unsettling warning. I checked the door, made sure it was locked, and tried to reassure him, telling him it was probably just a deer. But from that moment, a subtle unease settled in. The cabin started to smell strange, a mix of old dust and something faintly sweet, almost like rotting fruit. I just chalked it up to the natural smells of the forest, perhaps the humidity. The next evening, I was lying in bed reading, with Buster asleep at my feet. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound outside the house, like someone moving through the undergrowth. I held my breath, trying to listen, but the sound quickly faded. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something. But a few minutes later, I heard a clearer sound, coming from the side of the house, directly below my bedroom window. It was soft, like someone moving cautiously, their feet crunching on dead leaves and twigs. My heart started to pound. Buster lifted his head, ears perked, letting out a low whimper. I crept to the window and peered through the thick curtains, but it was pitch black outside. I pulled the curtains tighter. I couldn't sleep. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard a soft click from the kitchen, like a doorknob turning. Immediately after, a faint creak, the sound of the back door being pushed open. My blood ran cold. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably, trying to dial 911. My heartbeat was deafening. Buster sprang up, rushing to the bedroom door, letting out a ferocious growl down the hallway. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving from the kitchen towards the bedroom. They were light, as if trying to be quiet, but each step echoed in my chest. I could almost feel the presence getting closer. I watched as my bedroom doorknob slowly, painstakingly, began to turn down. I could see a sliver of light from the hallway through the crack, but then it was completely obscured by a large shadow. The door slowly pushed open a crack. I saw a dark figure, incredibly tall, completely filling the doorway. It made no sound, just stood there. I could almost feel it staring at me in the darkness. Fear paralyzed me, but instinct took over. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, the lamp from my nightstand, and swung it with all my might at where I guessed the figure's head would be. I heard a dull thud and a low grunt. The shadow staggered but didn't fall. I knew I had one chance. I scrambled around the foot of the bed and lunged for the other bedroom window. I slammed into it with all my force, glass shattering everywhere. Buster was barking furiously behind me, and I heard a guttural snarl from the figure, followed by the sound of it rushing towards me. I threw myself out the window, not caring about the broken glass underfoot or if I would fall. I stumbled and crawled into the dark woods, Buster right at my heels. I could hear branches snapping behind me. The person was chasing me. I ran blindly, not knowing how long, until my phone finally got a signal, and I managed to call 911. The police arrived. They searched the cabin but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, other than the window I had broken. They suggested it might have been an animal, or that I was just overly stressed. They even implied I might have broken the window myself. I knew that wasn't true. Everything in the cabin was as it had been, except for that shattered pane. The police told me they'd increase patrols, but they didn't sound like they believed me. I didn't go back into the cabin that night. Instead, I drove straight out of there, Buster curled up at my feet. As I passed a coffee shop, I considered stopping for a jolt, but then I saw a familiar black SUV in my rearview mirror. It had been parked on a nondescript side road near the cabin earlier. The windows were tinted black, and I couldn't see inside. The car just sat there, no lights on, like a predator lurking in the shadows. I didn't dare look back, I just sped away. I haven't been alone in a remote place since. Every time I'm home alone, especially at night, I always feel like someone is out there, watching me from the dark. I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes, even though I never truly saw them. I just know they're watching always. This happened last winter, around November 2024. I was in Houston for a business trip and needed a place to stay for a few nights. Hotels were either fully booked or ridiculously expensive, so I found a decent-looking house on Airbnb. The photos showed a typical suburban single-family home with a spacious living room, kitchen, and a separate basement. The host's description mentioned she lived upstairs and the basement had its own private entrance. I thought it was convenient, avoiding direct interaction with the host, and the price was reasonable. It was a Tuesday when I checked in, a cold and rainy day. I dragged my suitcase along the path the host had described in her message and found the basement entrance on the side of the house. It was a keyless entry, and the door opened with the code. The basement was a bit darker than it appeared in the photos, but it was clean and tidy. I dropped off my luggage, tidied up a bit, and then headed out for work. When I returned that evening, I noticed my power bank was missing from the nightstand. I distinctly remembered putting it there because I had charged my phone with it earlier. I searched the entire room, including my suitcase, but couldn't find it anywhere. I was puzzled but didn't think much of it, assuming I had misplaced it. The next morning, I got up to use the bathroom and found that my toothbrush had been moved. I always kept it on the far right of the toothbrush holder, but now it was in the middle. This sent a shiver down my spine. It was a small detail, but it felt wrong. I told myself I must have been too tired the night before to notice. Then, as I was getting ready to leave, I realized my company ID badge was missing from my jacket pocket. That badge was essential for my work. I panicked, searching everywhere, and eventually found it incredibly tucked deep within the cushions of the living room sofa. This was extremely odd. I hadn't spent much time in the living room, let alone shoved my ID badge into the sofa. A distinct feeling of being watched began to creep into my mind. That night, upon returning, I made sure to double-check all the doors and windows, confirming they were locked. I even placed an empty water glass on the doorknob of the main internal door, thinking it would fall if anyone tried to open it. I finished getting ready for bed and lay down, scrolling through news on my phone. Around 1 a.m., I heard some very faint sounds coming from directly above me, like footsteps on a wooden floor. At first, I thought it was just the host moving around upstairs, but the sounds soon became clearer, and they didn't sound like normal walking. It was more like someone moving slowly, cautiously, each step carrying a suppressed weight. I held my breath, staring intently at the ceiling. The sounds continued for about 5 or 6 minutes, then suddenly stopped. I waited for a long time, but nothing else happened. I tried to tell myself it was an old house with poor soundproofing, or just my imagination. But sleep was impossible. I remained on high alert all night. I didn't fall asleep. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. At 3:30 a.m., I heard an almost imperceptible click from the only other door in the basement, the internal connecting door to the host's living area. The sound was so faint that if I hadn't been on high alert, I would have missed it entirely. Immediately after, I heard the doorknob being slowly turned. My heart rate instantly soared, my blood feeling like it had turned to ice. I saw a thin sliver of light beneath the door, seemingly emanating from a crack on the other side. The light was very dim, flickering, as if someone was holding a flashlight and probing beyond the door. Then, the doorknob was gently pressed down. I heard the door let out a soft creak, and then the smell of rotten sweetness wafted into my room, far more potent than anything I had smelled before. I held my breath, staring motionless at the door. I watched as the gap in the door widened slightly, and a dark, flattened shadow slipped in from beneath the door, then stopped. It didn't move, as if waiting in the darkness. Adrenaline made me do something I normally wouldn't dare. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand, snatched my phone, and then bolted for the basement exit. I heard a thud from the door behind me, as if the shadow had been startled by my sudden movement. I didn't look back, desperately scrambling up the steps, my fingers fumbling to input the code. I heard a rapid series of footsteps in the basement, as if someone was chasing me. The moment the keypad lock clicked, signifying the door was unlocked, I yanked it open and burst out. I didn't even stop to close the door, rushing out into the rainy night. The cold rain lashed my face, and I felt a wave of dizziness, but I couldn't stop. I ran frantically toward my car, keys gripped tightly in my hand. I heard a loud slam from behind me, and then, from the corner of my eye, I caught sight of the basement entrance door being violently pulled open. A tall figure stood there, unmoving in the rain, staring directly at me. I started the car, hitting the gas without a second thought, driving away from that cursed Airbnb without looking back. I drove directly to the nearest 24-hour convenience store and, trembling, messaged the host, saying I had an urgent personal matter and needed to check out early. I didn't mention anything about the basement. The host replied quickly, saying, "No problem, I understand," and wished me a safe journey. Her tone was too calm, unnervingly so. I didn't call the police because I knew they probably wouldn't find anything, and I couldn't explain what I had seen. After that day, my life completely changed. I've never dared to stay in an Airbnb again, and I feel uneasy about any accommodation with a separate entrance. Whenever I'm alone, especially at night, I always remember that smell of rotten sweetness and the flattened dark shadow that slipped under the door. What unnerves me the most is that I always feel it wasn't just a coincidence. The day after I left Houston, I saw a small, inconspicuous news report about a house fire in the suburbs, with severe damage to the basement. Although no specific address was given, I always had a feeling it was the house I had stayed in. I often wonder, if I hadn't escaped in time, what would that shadow have done to me? What was it exactly? I probably will never have an answer to that question. This happened 3 years ago. I had just quit my job and was looking for a place to truly unwind and clear my head. I found an Airbnb deep in the forests of northern Maine. The description said it was completely isolated, which was exactly what I was looking for. I arrived as dusk was settling. The place was indeed remote. It took a long drive down a bumpy dirt road to get there. The cabin looked much older than in the photos, surrounded by dense, unyielding pine trees. Inside, there was a faint musty smell, mixed with the scent of burnt wood. I dropped my bags. There was no cell service, and the Wi-Fi wouldn't connect. The host had warned me the internet might be spotty, but I hadn't expected it to be completely dead. Well, this is what you wanted, complete isolation, I told myself. I started a fire in the fireplace, brewed some tea, and curled up on the couch, enjoying the long-awaited peace. A light rain began to fall, pattering on the roof, and I soon drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I was woken by a strange sound. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was a disjointed, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across a floor. It sounded like it was coming from upstairs. But there was no upstairs in this cabin. I shot upright, my heart beginning to race. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound stopped. I told myself it must be the old house settling, with expanding and contracting. I got out of bed and went into the living room. All the windows were closed. I pulled back the curtains, and outside, it was foggy with poor visibility. Just then, I noticed a bouquet of fresh wildflowers on the kitchen table. I remembered clearly, the table had been empty when I went to bed last night. My stomach churned, and a chilling sensation crawled up my spine. I walked over to the table. The flowers were simple, as if freshly picked from the woods, still damp with dew. I tried to convince myself that maybe the host had quietly come by while I was asleep to leave them, but the thought itself was unnerving. That afternoon, I tried to go for a walk, hoping to get some fresh air and shake off these strange thoughts. I followed a small path beside the cabin into the woods, but after only a short while, I became disoriented. All the trees in the forest looked identical, and the ground was covered in pine needles. I couldn't tell which way was which. Panic began to set in. I called out, but heard nothing but echoes. Eventually, relying on instinct, I stumbled through the woods for what felt like an eternity before finally making it back to the cabin as dusk approached. I was exhausted and terrified. When I pushed open the cabin door, a cold gust of wind hit me. I realized that the fire in the fireplace had gone out, and what was worse, all the doors and windows I had locked were now open. They were open just a crack, enough to let the cold wind howl in. I even found a small wooden doll by the bed in the bedroom, which absolutely had not been there before. The doll's face was distorted, seemingly mocking me. Fear washed over me like a tidal wave. I rushed to lock all the doors and windows tightly, then locked myself in the bedroom, trembling and hugging my knees. That night, the terror escalated. I huddled under the covers, staring at the closed bedroom door. Outside, I started hearing distinct footsteps, right there in the living room. Heavy, dragging footsteps, one after another, echoing on the floorboards. I could even hear the wood creaking, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the house. I grabbed my phone, desperately pressing buttons, trying to find any sliver of a signal, but there was nothing. Then, the footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I could feel someone standing behind the door, motionless. A suffocating sense of oppression filled the air. I heard a very faint, scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across the wooden door, and then a sigh. It wasn't the wind, nor the house settling. It was a human sound. I was so scared I couldn't even breathe, tears streaming down my face. I heard the doorknob slowly turning, once, then again. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was all a dream. But then there was a knocking sound on the door, not a forceful knock, but a slow, rhythmic tapping, gently, over and over, as if playing with me. Each tap felt like a hammer blow to my heart. I don't know how long the knocking lasted. It felt like an eternity. Eventually it stopped. I lay still, my body rigid, afraid to move. A very long time passed, so long I almost thought the person had left, when suddenly, I heard a sharp shattering of glass coming from the kitchen. I bolted upright, my fear momentarily forgotten by the instinct to escape. Without bothering with shoes, I scrambled out of the bedroom window. The window was small, and it took a lot of effort to squeeze through, cutting myself in several places. I stumbled blindly into the dark woods, the pine needles and dead branches scratching my feet. I had no sense of direction, just ran desperately, hearing the muffled sounds from the cabin behind me. I don't know how long I ran or how many times I fell, until I finally saw a faint light. It was a road. I ran like a madman to the roadside, frantically waving my arms, hoping a car would pass by. Eventually, a passing truck stopped. The driver, a kind old man, was startled by my disheveled, injured appearance. He took me to the nearest small town, where I reported everything to the police. When the police arrived at the cabin, they found the doors and windows pried open, the interior in disarray, and indeed, the kitchen window shattered. They found nothing else, no trace of anyone, except the mess I had left behind. They said it could have been a transient or a burglar, but I knew it wasn't. I knew it was a person, and they were there. Since that day, I've had an extreme fear of any remote location. I've never stayed alone again, and whenever it's late at night, I can still hear that slow, rhythmic knocking and that faint scratching sound like fingernails on wood. I don't know who that person was, or why they did what they did, or if they're still in those woods. But I know for certain that during my time of isolation, I was not alone. And they knew everything about me, long before I even knew they existed.